Hello, everyone. Welcome. Jonathan, you see my screen, right?
Yes.
Perfect. And you still see it?
Something's wrong with it now. Oh, there we go. Now it's good.
Perfect. Great. Well, yeah, I figure we'll just give people a couple minutes to finish joining. We had 29 registrants, but I know that not everybody can always sign up, or can always show up. So we'll give it a moment. Well, go ahead and get started and people can kind of filter in. So first of all, I just wanted to say welcome to the AIARE Continuing Education webinar series. My name is Sarah McGregor. I'm AIARE's Member Services Manager. I'm also an AIARE instructor and Splitboard guide. And I am super excited for this topic with Jonathan Shefftz. Excuse me. Jonathan Shefftz is a
You're supposed to pronounce the last name incorrectly, not the first name.
Yeah, so Jonathan is also an AIARE instructor and he's on the American Avalanche Association's board and he knows a ton about beacons. This webinar will account for one of your 8 required continuing education hours for this season. And if you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm most likely the human behind any phone calls that you may have been directed toward AIARE or any emails that you may have directed toward the help inbox. I'm super happy to be helpful. I know it can be kind of confusing. We have hosted a whole handful of webinars throughout the season so far on a variety of topics, some of which these recordings are already available if they were free. Others, if they were made available for a fee, they are going to be made available to you at the end of the season. So hopefully those are some great resources for you. And there will be another final webinar hosted by Mammut next week, and I'll drop a link to register for that in the chat at the end of our session today. So without further ado, the topic tonight, actually, I do have to share that this webinar is being recorded. So if you agree to remain in this webinar, you consent to being present for the recorded session. Your name or voice will only appear in the recording if you ask a question at the end. And tonight's webinar is on why beacons are imperfect. And Jonathan will be talking about interference and how to teach searches in light of such imperfection and more ways on how we can be better educators on the topic. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask them in the chat, in the Q&A, or you can just raise your hand and I'll be monitoring that throughout the session. And I think I'm ready to hand it over to you, Jonathan.
Sounds good.
Stop share and give you capability to share your presentation.
Thanks for the intro. Thanks to everyone for joining, and thanks to AIARE for putting on this series. One of the few positive aspects of the pandemic is we all finally realized that, hey, we can have CE over the internet. And also, thanks to the particular way this presentation came around, which I think is very symbolic of AIARE's collaborative approach in general. When I first saw one of the Beacon CE webinars being advertised, I emailed, I think it was Liz, and I said, what's up with this? This looks more like an advertisement for one particular company. And she got back to me right away and said, oh, actually, we've reached out to all the different beacon companies. And if you want to do some sort of interview, how about if you do a webinar? I said, oh, okay, good idea. Which reminds me of my very first involvement with AIARE when I took my instructor training course back in, I think it was 2005 or 2006. We had a great 3 days at the base of Mount Washington. When I filled out the evaluation form, the section for the course materials, I wrote a comment, too many typos. Almost immediately got an email back from the legendary Murph saying, what do you mean too many typos? We checked all that so carefully. I provided him with a partial list and he responded, oh, okay, how'd you like to do copy editing from now on? So I did a lot of copy editing and it was great to be involved that way. However, I've not done that in recent years. So if you do find any typos in any AIARE materials, it's not my fault. Okay, so on with the presentation. Oh, first of all, in case you're wondering what's going on in the background there, that's what used to be my home office, but now it's shared with our daughter's Lego City. So perhaps we can have a guided tour at the end. Now let's see. Oh, other big caveat is, although I do a lot of webinar type presentations, they're for testifying as an expert witness in deposition in federal court. And so I don't have any experience in going back and forth, sharing my screen and showing me, but we'll see if I can get it right. So share screen, click. Did I do it right?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, good. Okay, so for people who are A3 board members, you might remember this presentation. I'm sorry, A3 members, you might remember this as a presentation, very similar presentation I gave a little over a year ago. I've modified it though to focus on what we can do about that as AIARE instructors for the rescue portions of our course. Since, as I've kind of subtitled this or alternatively titled it, quote, something is wrong with my beacon. If you've been teaching avalanche courses, you've probably heard that complaint many times from your students. Now, occasionally, yeah, something is really wrong. The thing's broken. Electronic failures happen. More often, it's more like something's wrong with the student's skills or the student's understandings of what a beacon can do and what a beacon can't do. So in this webinar, I'll be talking about the inherent imperfections of avalanche beacons under the current spec and how you can help teach your students in light of that. One thing you should do though, in addition to all this, is before your course, poll your students on what beacons they are bringing with them. And if there are any models that you are not familiar with, go download that user manual ahead of time, read through it, make sure you understand it. I know that's not probably a really fun thing to do, but that means if a student has questions, you'll be prepared to answer it. And I think you'll look good in your students' eyes that way. Oops, page down, arrow down. What am I doing wrong here? Oh, next.
Can you just click it? Did that work?
Oh, there we go. That
Perfect.
worked. Okay, click, disclaimers. So I'm not going to be reviewing individual beacon models here. That's not my point. Plus, all the ones on the market are good these days anyways. Not addressing particular shortcomings of particular models, except for some discontinued models that I will discuss. And any particular beacons I'm going to show that I just happen to own, they're my personal preferences. It's not an endorsement. All the beacons on the model, all the models on the market these days are perfectly fine. A big difference from when I started doing this about 15 years ago. So they're all good, but they're all not perfect. So what you're probably going to hear a lot from your students these days, and this is something that's only going to increase over time, is, but my phone can do all these things. And yeah, that's kind of true. I came to cell phones rather late. I didn't have my first smartphone until 2010. I know some of you youngsters who were almost born with these things are thinking, how is that possible? How did we live without these phones until then? And indeed, I mean, it's just amazing what a phone can do. Why can't a beacon do all that? Well, First, you've got huge economies of scale. Don't worry, I'm not going to get into a lot of economics here, and admittedly, I did not look up the numbers, but the number of beacons sold is lost in the rounding compared to the number of phones sold worldwide each year. Plus, you kind of have, and because of that, you have a very limited number of beacon companies. Basically, there's one each for these 5 major alpine countries. Years ago, Italy and Canada also used to have beacon companies, but those are long since gone. Plus, of course, the purchase price of a phone is heavily subsidized by all the subscription revenue. By contrast, someone sells you a beacon, well, that's the end of their revenue from it. There's nothing else they're going to be getting from you. Plus, it's a very small, undifferentiated market. By that, I mean, even though beacons do range a bit in price, and some are more marketed toward the pro end of the spectrum, some are marketed more towards the bro end of the spectrum, really what distinguishes the beacon models within one company's line, it's all pretty small. I mean, you could take what's marketed as an entry-level beacon, it would be fine for a professional. You could take a model that's marketed for professionals, it would be fine for absolute beginners too. And that's a big difference from, let's see if I can stop share and do a brief intro, brief video. For ski bindings, by contrast, touring bindings, you've got everything on the market from many, many models of these teeny weeny little small Skimo race bindings. And then you've got all sorts of frame bindings out there and all sorts of things in between. You really just don't have that with beacons. There's one model I always thought it would have been interesting if they maybe expanded the design and make it weigh like, 3 pounds and have a much bigger screen, and it could be truly a professional only model, but I just don't see there's any market for that. So we've never seen anything like that. So let's see, going back to share screen. Hopefully I'm back on this now.
Looks good.
Nope, thank you. So then you might say, well, why not use all the processing power in a phone and have it add a beacon function? Well, there's one big problem with that. And the reason I'm showing this is that a few years ago, I was contacted by an electrical engineering professor at the local university. And he said some of the students for their senior project were going to do something for beacon searching. And they heard I might have some beacons they can borrow to use as targets. And I said, yes, of course, you've come to the right person, but I'm curious, you're an electrical engineering professor. Can't you just go down to your local electron hut and buy some spare parts and make your own target beacon? I mean, all you're doing is you're just transmitting a signal. That should be really easy, right? And he said to me, funny you should ask. I went to a colleague who is one of the world's foremost antenna experts. And he said, oh my gosh, just go buy yourself a beacon. You don't want to deal with having to come up with an antenna on your own that transmits on that frequency. And the reason is, maybe I'm dating myself here with an old XFiles episode, but I did happen to watch this one, and it's sort of relevant to beacon searching. This is not one with space aliens and black stuff or whatever it was that infected people. Instead, there's some guy who's kind of gone crazy and keeps hearing this weird sound. And the punchline of sorts is that he lives right across something, right above something that actually used to exist, a huge underground antenna that the US Navy maintained for one-way communication with US nuclear submarines. Now, what does that have to do with avalanche beacons? Well, in order to have a frequency that could go deep underwater, you need a really, really long wavelength. And to do that, you need a really, really big antenna, one that is miles long. In fact, there was even a crazy Cold War proposal that would cover almost half the state of Wisconsin with buried underground antennas to allow for two-way communication with nuclear submarines deep underneath the ocean. Now, we need to get not underneath an ocean to rescue someone, but under a few meters of snow. Still, though, that requires a really long wavelength. And an avalanche beacon is pretty darn small. So the way they put that antenna in a beacon is pretty impressive, and there's just no way you can fit it inside a cell phone. There have been some cell phone apps that have purported to be useful for avalanche rescue, but they were borderline criminal. They worked so poorly. The other problem is that you need to have beacons that can work for the lowest common denominator. So what on earth is this? This is a relatively simple computer application whose development I managed under contract to a federal government agency. I was working with a software developer. When we came up with the first draft of this, we thought we had done the best job designing it. It was so intuitive and easy to use. We did such a great job. Then I unveiled the beta test version of it at a training course, and wow, it was terrible. No one could figure out how to use it. It was great for me and my software developer. We sure thought it was intuitive, but more ordinary folks did not. And realistically, with an avalanche beacon, you've got to have it to be as easy to use for everybody and in a panic situation. So that also limits the development of avalanche beacons. But the real problem is the beacon spec itself. This was designed, you can actually see the date there for the most recent revision, 2001, at least I think that's the most recent revision. It's really, really simple. All it does is this 1,000 plus or minus 300 milliseconds. Basically, that means about every second, the beacon goes beep. That's all the signal is doing. There's nothing fancy encoded in that signal. There's nothing secret about it. It's just going beep. That's also why, to emphasize that to your students, hopefully I've clicked stop share here. I think all avalanche instructors should have an analog beacon that produces real analog acoustics. I think the only model currently on the market that does that is the Ortovox. A few others used to. I could be wrong about that. I think this is the only current model. But these old Ortovox F1s, you can get these really easily on eBay. There are so many of these floating out there. And what's great about it is it allows you to really hear the signal. That's what's going on. That's all the beacon is telling you. And that also limits what a beacon can do in terms of its processing that signal to find it. By the way, one other really important thing about having one of these, so I highly recommend everyone track down an old F1 on eBay or wherever, is, some of these are still in circulation. They shouldn't be, but they still are being used in the field. And the on-off switch is not really very intuitive for this. And long after this model was discontinued, Ortovox did continue to manufacture some models with essentially the same on-off switch. So at avalanche courses, I show this beacon to students and I say, okay, try turning this off. Well, how do you do it? Well, it's part of the harness. It's this little clip right here, and that's how you turn it off. This can also be very difficult to do with cold, numb, gloved fingers. At one avalanche course, I showed a woman how to do it, and this one student kept trying over and over, and she just couldn't. It's kind of an ingenious switch, but not the most intuitive. Okay, let's see if I can go back to share screen. Clickety click. Okay, click again. Okay, so given that all a transmitting beacon is doing is going beep and then going quiet about once every second, how is your searching beacon going to sense direction? Well, the answer is it really can't. All it's doing, let's see if I can go into stop share, is taking this old M1 here. It's pointing in one direction. Well, basically in olden times, you would point in one direction and listen, how strong is that signal? Then point in the other direction, 90 degrees off, and say, how strong is that signal there? And then you would bias your search direction toward where you got the louder signal. When BCA came up with the original tracker DTS, they had the brilliant idea no one else could come up with yet to put two receiving beacons inside two receiving antennas inside the housing of the beacon. So simultaneously, the beacon would be saying, how strong is the signal in this direction? How strong is the signal 90 degrees to that direction? Do some calculations for the relative strength and say, would go more or less in that direction. That's all the beacon can do. It doesn't sense where that signal is coming from. It's just simultaneously looking in two different directions, 90 degrees to each other, and trying to figure out somewhere in between is the strongest signal, and therefore you should go in that direction. So going back to this here, haven't messed up so far. Okay, but how can the beacon sense fore versus aft? In other words, it's sensing that signal strength. How does it know whether the transmitting beacon is in front or behind? The answer is it can't. The only way it can tell that is by whether the signal is getting stronger or weaker based on your movement. Now, there are some other complicated internals going on here. This is about a lawsuit between two beacon companies, and one of them was using a compass to try to aid that fore versus aft, and the other said it was patented. I would not advise trying to read all this, but the bottom line here is, what can you do for your students in order to help the beacon know whether the signal is in front or behind? The answer is beacons do better when there's some movement going on. If you're not moving at all, the beacon might misinterpret subtle changes in the signal just because of atmospheric conditions with movement by you and tell you to go the wrong way. So slow, steady movement is generally what you want to do with a beacon. So keep your students moving, even if they're momentarily confused. It's better just to keep moving in some direction and then see what happens with the beacon's indicators. Oh, sorry, one other point I forgot to make. Let me go back here. For direction, actually, sorry, that point's coming later. It's coming here, in fact. So how can the beacon sense distance? Well, you know the answer once again. It really can't. It's using signal strength as a proxy for distance. Now, why can't that be perfectly correlated? The answer is because, hopefully I'm doing this right again here, is because of the orientation of the transmitting beacon. Depending on that orientation and the coupling between the transmitting beacon of the victim and the searching beacon of the rescuer, that's going to affect the signal strength. So the beacon essentially has to guess how often is a buried beacon in different orientations, and what does that translate into for actual distance in the field. So the best coupling position is when the victim's beacon is pointing straight at the searcher and the searcher's beacon is pointing straight at the victim. The second worst is when it's off perpendicular, 90-degree angle. The worst possible position is when the beacon is, the transmitting beacon is perfectly upright like this. Now, Ortovox does have the smart antenna feature that is supposed to avoid this position. Essentially, if there's some sort of gyroscope or some other orientation sensing device inside the beacon. So if the beacon is transmitting and the housing is like this, pointing straight up, then instead of transmitting along the long axis of the housing, there's a separate antenna, a shorter antenna, but still long enough to transmit, that the beacon will transmit on. However, if it's transmitting on this antenna here, the short axis, still the beacon has no idea where the searcher is coming from. So it still could be, transmitting directly at the searcher. It could be transmitting off at a 90-degree angle. So that's still a factor that's going to make a big difference. What can you do as an instructor? What I would advise is get one of those big open reel measuring tapes, stake out a field with distances, actual meters, and then take a beacon, bury it in different, or have it just sitting on the ground in different orientations, and show students how that affects the distance readings on their searching beacons. And you'll also see how different beacons interpret the same signal strength as different distances. It's also very helpful, I think, to stake out a field and show distances for setting up search strip widths. We always talk about what is the optimal search strip width. If you have a very, very wide debris field and the point last seen, place last seen is somewhat vague and you don't have a lot of searchers, if you have a very narrow search strip width, then it's going to be hard to effectively and quickly cover that entire debris field with the number of searchers you have. On the other hand, if you spread out your searchers even more, there's a possibility your searchers are going to come right down and miss someone in between. So we talk about what that optimum distance is, but who has a really good mental impression of what 25 or 30 or 35 meters looks like in the field? Practice that with your students, and I think that will be really helpful. Okay, back to share screen. Click again. Okay, how can the beacon sense multiple signals? Well, you probably know what's coming up by now. It can't. So it's not like each beacon is saying, I am such and such company, such and such model, serial number, such and such. All it's doing is going beep. That's what the spec says. So how can a beacon figure out more than one signal being transmitted from a multiple person burial and then try to suppress a signal once it's already found? What it's dealing with, it's like a race car track, but you don't have this bird's eye view of looking at all the different cars. Instead, you're right here. I'm not sure if people can see my cursor, but you're right here at this checkered area. And the person doesn't have a bird's eye view, rather the beacon doesn't have a bird's eye view. Instead, it's looking straight down across the track. So what does it see? It sees the leading edge of cars essentially coming across that one point and then eventually disappearing. And then there's a gap for the next car to come through. And this is another situation where it's really helpful to have an analog beacon and to listen to multiple signals at the same time. If you listen carefully, usually, yeah, you can sense that there are differences among different beacons. Sometimes it's just random. Sometimes it's deliberate. There's one company that actually, if a beacon is started up in the presence of another beacon, it will try to alter its pattern so it's slightly different than the others. But when you looked at that beacon spec, there is quite a bit of plus and minus in terms of the total cycle time, the on time, and the off, that is quiet time in between those beeps. So the beacon is looking at all those little subtle differences among these cars, in a sense, going along the racetrack. Some cars are longer than others. Some cars are going slightly faster than others. It's trying to pick up on all those different clues. What that means, for one thing, I'm a strong advocate of, when you have a beacon test or a beacon contest to see who can find however many beacons in a certain amount of time, I really think that should be structured so it's something like 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 trials. Because even though it might seem like an even playing field, you might have the same beacons buried in exactly the same place for each student or each contestant or each applicant trying to pass a guiding exam. And they might be all the same beacons, but they're going to be in sync or out of sync with each other in potentially different patterns just based on this passage of time from one student or one applicant's round to the other. So that means one student might be trying to find 3 beacons that are all totally out of sync with each other, which is good in terms of making it very easy to tell the different beacons apart. On the other hand, another student who comes up next might suddenly find all the beacon signals have come perfectly in sync with each other, and it's really hard to differentiate among them, whether you're just listening to it with your own ear or using the different signal suppression functions of a beacon. In other words, it's the equivalent of 2 of these cars suddenly matching exactly the same speed, exactly in sync with each other and exactly the same length. If that persists as they come along this racetrack, it's going to be incredibly hard to differentiate among them. But eventually, since there's quite a bit of plus or minus there, they'll drift back out of sync again. Perhaps while the student is still searching for those beacons, or maybe to that student's great frustration by the time the next student comes along. Now, what makes this even more complicated, although fortunately less so over the years, is ghosting. And that's when a searching beacon thinks there's more than one beacon, or rather more than the beacon, more than the number of beacons that are really out there. That old Ortovox F1 that I was showing was a big offender in that category. And it was actually kind of a deliberate design, a very clever design for its day, because it was designed long before there was any digital processing for beacons. So the beacon spec says the beacon has to go beep, then it has to stay quiet, then it keeps repeating that cycle forever. However, Ortovox came up with the idea that there'd be a very, very small sound called a continuous carrier signal, or it's called continuous background signal in this graphic, just barely audible. I'm not sure how that still passed the official spec, but somehow it was. And the idea was that a searcher is listening, and instead of having complete silence in between those major beeps that would make the searcher wonder, what's going on? Is there still a beacon beeping there? There would be this little background noise to assure the searcher that, yep, there's still a signal. The problem is a lot of digital modern beacons that can sense different signals hear that really loud beep, and then they hear that very faint background signal, and they think, oh, there are two beacons here. Don't worry, there's still only one person buried, but it can really confound some searches with the ghosting. Fortunately, this will become a far less important problem over time as these older beacons are finally retired. So, how can the beacon deal with interference? Ha, fooled you this time. Actually quite well. Now, I realize there has been a post that's been making its way on Facebook. I think it was from the Canadian Avalanche Association, maybe somebody else. A lot of big warnings about interference from other electronic devices. Can this happen? Yeah, sure, absolutely it can. Fortunately, it's very, very easy to test. Take your beacon of choice, whatever it is, have it searching, and then take whatever electronic devices you commonly use, put them right up to the beacon, and see what happens. See how close you have to get to cause all sorts of weird ghost signals and background noise and all sorts of other bad stuff and haywire distance and directional indicators. And then learn, yeah, you better keep your device that far away when you're searching. Unlike other tests for beacons, this one is really, really easy to use. You know what electronics you have, put it up against the beacon that you know you're going to be using when you're in search mode, and you'll learn how far apart you need to be. Other devices that you're just going to keep in your pack, like a Garmin InReach or other emergency satellite device, it's being kept in your pack. It's not really a concern. I have noticed some things, like when I take out my phone sometimes, take a picture of a screen, a beacon screen, when I'm conducting tests. Yeah, if it's close, it's going to cause all sorts of problems, but I just put it a little bit away. I can take a picture fine, and the searching is not changed at all. Otherwise, as far as electronic devices interfering with a transmitting beacon, I have never heard a credible report of that. If you can show me something that can be reproduced, I'd certainly like to hear of it, but I have never seen any credible reports of electronic devices interfering with a transmitting beacon. It's only with a searching beacon. Plus, in general, I certainly hope no one's going to be going out there searching for a real victim using a phone right there. Conceivably, yeah, you might have your phone up here if you're trying to call in for a rescue, if you think that's a good idea. Personally, I don't. There are different schools of thought on that, but you should have the beacon, far away from your body, arms outstretched, not right up against your chest, slowly scanning it back and forth. So I really think a lot of those concerns are very overblown about electronic devices interfering with a searching beacon. And for people who say, well, let's err on the side of caution, there's only so many things you can get your students and real people in the field on a tour to be worried about. As an economist, I'm always thinking in terms of opportunity cost. I think one term that's used now is bandwidth. People have only so much bandwidth to devote to safety issues or pretty much anything. If you get them freaking out about like a Garmin InReach or other satellite device in their backpack, it's taking away their attention from something that really is going to matter more. However, for a transmitting beacon, one thing that's very interesting, I was contacted, looking quick. This is pretty old. I think this is from 2014. And I can't remember the exact chain here, but I was working with, and still am with, Steve Akelis at beaconreviews.com. And it was something about how a student in an avalanche course got an error on his Ortovox Pulse beacon. You can see there I replicated the alert 457 send error, a transmission error, and he thought it might have something to do with the energy gel packets that he had in his coat pocket. And this is what I wrote at the time. Mine tested avalanche beacons and energy gel packets. This is like my life's calling. GU was the sponsor of my Schema Race series at the time. Now it's Hammer Gel, but I'm pretty sure it would have the same reaction. And this was relatively easy to test. I took an avalanche beacon, I set it up transmitting, took another beacon, found it just fine. And then I partially covered it with a whole bunch of gel packets. Sure enough, the signal pretty much disappeared. Now, you might think, and rightly so, we were talking about wavelengths earlier, the 457 frequency. That's designed to penetrate many meters of snow. How could it not penetrate a few millimeters of goo? Well, the answer is it can, but these packets have a metal foil lining in them. I confirmed that by contacting the company. The same effect could be had if you took your sandwich and you wrapped it in aluminum foil. Now, if you have gel packets elsewhere in other pockets, it's not going to have the same effect. But this really did happen to one person. It's good that the beacon alerted him to that problem. Otherwise, he would have had no idea. For those of you who think, who on earth goes touring with that many gel packets? Well, you're listening to him. That's me. Usually I don't have them. I don't think I've ever had them in a pocket where it could interfere that way. But yeah, if you had it in a chest or a belly pocket of your jacket and it was overlapping with the beacon and its harness, yeah, this could definitely happen. So be aware of that. Same thing could happen with metal objects. When I first started way back in the day, there were some people that said, oh, you should use a plastic shovel because a metal shovel could interfere with your avalanche beacon. Well, it could if you had the habit of carrying your avalanche shovel in front of your chest, then yes, it would do a pretty good job in blocking your avalanche beacon signal. However, if you're carrying your beacon there, you've got other problems. If it's in your pack, it's pretty much impossible that it's going to be interfering with the beacon signal. So with all those imperfections in mind, can beacons somehow become perfect? I say no. Or at least not with the current beacon spec. It's amazing what the manufacturers have done with that beacon spec. You've heard, I forget how many we've had so far, but we've had a lot of manufacturers talk about all the latest things in their beacons, and they're great. And especially that they're having to overcome searching for something that just goes beep. Now, there is a secondary frequency that Mahmout-Barryvox uses that was also licensed for a while to ARVA, but it really doesn't do all that much. And plus, since they have to search for all the other beacons, it's just really hard to do things like distance and direction, fore aft, multiple beacon signals. The spec was never designed with that in mind. There have been a lot of interesting potential breakthrough models, but unfortunately, they really haven't worked out that well. There was one model that was going to have GPS functionality to aid in searching. It would keep track of where the searcher was going. I'm not sure exactly how it was supposed to work. Unfortunately, the beacon company didn't really seem to have that figured out either because it was delayed for many years. It was on the market very briefly. Then all models were recalled with a full refund or a replacement model. So maybe it will come back in a better form, but so much for that idea. There was a very interesting model that kind of it was like an old cell phone flip phone. It went into search by flipping out the screen, and then the screen, instead of just showing numbers and arrows or a list of beacons, kind of showed a graphical array, and it showed little buried symbols. And the idea was it would produce a map, a buried treasure map of where all the buried signals were. That sort of worked, but it really just didn't add all that much. The screen, in a way, wasn't big enough, and it suffered from all the other issues with directional and distances. So eventually, even though that was a pretty cool model, it was discontinued with no direct replacement. The third antenna, I haven't talked about that because actually it does work pretty well. The third antenna is perpendicular to the other two antennas, and it's used only in the final search mode to deal with nulls and spikes. There's one company that has, or maybe had, I can't remember if it's still produced. You go into search by flipping out something that, well, basically kind of looks like an antenna. It's the third antenna. It's supposed to be used also in the secondary search, not just in the final search phase. As far as anyone can tell, has tested it, it doesn't really seem to add anything. Oh, and then the secondary frequency from Mahmout-Barryvox that debuted with the Pulse model. It was named that not because it really has a heart rate monitor, but it senses minute vibrations of a buried victim to attempt to tell if that victim is still alive. And then it transmits that information to compatible models, both from Barryvox and previously from ARVA, but that's basically the extent of what it does. Can beacons become better? Yes, absolutely. And indeed, they have become so much better. My wife and I took our first avalanche safety course as students way back in February 2001. The summer before, when we were getting all into this, my wife said, "So what beacons are we buying?" And I said, "Oh, I got this all figured out. I found a used Ortovox M1 on eBay, and a Peeps OptiFinder, and this is how these models work." Just wait. What? This sounds very complicated. What's the easiest beacon to use? I said, "Oh, everyone says it's the Tracker DTS." And he said, "Buy 2 of those now," which we did. And we practiced a lot. They definitely had their shortcomings back in the day, but wow, for a single burial search, those things were so much better than anything on the market at the time. When we took our avalanche course, when it came time for the beacon searching, split up into groups. We watched a couple students go out with an instructor. They all had analog models, and they slowly, carefully, eventually found the buried beacon. Then it became our turn. We basically just sprinted straight to the buried beacon, and everyone looked at us like we had X-ray vision or something. And since then, beacons have become even better. For a long time, basic analog beacons coexisted alongside the Tracker DTS. And when I first started reviewing beacons back and testing them back around 2005, beacons were so different. It was like you were comparing to, comparing Skimo race skis to fatty skis. Each one has its advantages and massive disadvantages. Since then, they've become so much better each year. When a current new flagship model comes out from a company, it's so much better than its predecessors. Size, there are some teeny ones that work really well. Frequency drift testers are super helpful. You as an instructor absolutely should have a model that can test frequency drift. I forget how many different companies right now have that feature, but it's amazing how many older, especially analog models you'll find that are way out of spec. Multiple transmission antennas, talked about that briefly to avoid worst case coupling for a buried beacon. Analog mode option, unfortunately, I think Ortovox is the only one that still has that now. Personally, I think that's a great feature. Range has gotten way better. The original tracker GTS had much shorter range. It had 2 antennas, crossed antennas, that I think is the reason it had shorter range. But now, yeah, you can have it all. There are models, even the model with the shortest range on the market still has much better range than models used to. The fine search phase has gotten so much better with the 3rd antenna, no more nulls and spikes. There are some models that have also interesting cues to get you to do a better job. Signal suppression reliability. The original PEEPS GPS was way ahead of the curve in terms of introducing this feature. On the other hand, it did not really work all that reliably when it was first introduced. That's gotten so much better since then. I think probably a lot of you saw this already, but last year I was invited to be a beta tester for Ortovox with its new beacon model. And they told us that we would be receiving the package in advance of the webinar they were going to host, and we should not open the package ahead of time. So it was very exciting. It was like, you know, a kid on Christmas or Hanukkah or your birthday or whatever. And I managed to restrain myself. I did not open it up beforehand. And then we had the dramatic unveiling. All of us online simultaneously opened up our packages and took out the new beacon, the direct voice. And wow, it talks to you. It works really, really, really well. Now, of course, it's kind of a Captain Obvious thing. As AIARE instructors, you probably had, I think you're all required to have the same first aid training and use an AAD. And yeah, of course, the AAD talks to you. It tells you what to do. It's especially important for an avalanche beacon because so many times you've had students who, you know, they go around doing their searching and they're mesmerized by that screen, just like they are looking at their smartphones all day, to such an extent that they're not noticing when, you know, there might be a clue on the ground, even an arm outstretched. There have been many, many real life burials where, yeah, you know, the person is critically buried in terms of the airway being completely covered, but there's still an arm that's poking through, or a ski, or a leg or something. And so by getting you to be able to listen to the beacon and simultaneously get all the information, that's a huge advance. And I think this is a great model, especially for people who realistically aren't the best searchers out there. It's still a fine model for pro types. You know, personally, I have my preferences. I like some things about it, some things I don't, other than the voice feature. But I think every model on the market would be a better model if it had this voice feature in addition to everything else about it. But as exciting as that unveiling was, the beacon still has all the same limitations that we discussed before, since it's searching for beacons transmitting on that same spec. So I think that's it. I've been rattling on for a while. I don't know if Sarah's fielded any questions, but I will click the stop share here. And I think Sarah can.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. That was super informative. I'm sorry, I'm here.
Oh, actually, I'm sorry. One more thing I forgot to show in terms of how far beacons have come. I showed that old Ortovox F1. If you really want to show off to your students, to be a really cool instructor, you need to have an old Ortovox F2. This was the model that could search on 2 different frequencies because there is both a European frequency and an American frequency. They were incompatible with each other. So this model, I think there's another model or two from other companies that could simultaneously search on both frequencies. However, it's wonderfully primitive. In order to go into search mode, what you do is there's a plug there, and you stick headphones into that, and that switches the beacon into search. And then the only way to get any information from the beacon is to listen to those headphones. So think about that in a panic situation. You've got to take out headphones, stick a jack in, then stick the headphone in your ear and carefully listen the whole time. And if you lose the headphones or if it falls out of your ear, there's no way you can search. Also, if you really want to impress people, and I haven't been at this that long, fellow ski patroller, retired Army Colonel Greg Banner gave these to me. I was really psyched. This is even more obscure. So if you really want to impress your students, try to find these on eBay. This is the old Raymer beacon. So one model currently was in the news over the last year with a harness that had some issues. Well, this is the harness right here. Wow, look at this, pretty high tech, huh? You put it around your neck, and then when it's time to search, you open up the Velcro and you take out, at least I have trouble doing it even though I have gloves on. And here it is, the battery compartment is sticking a 9-volt battery in here. That turns it on. And then once again, to go between different modes, you take a headphone jack and you stick it in one of these holes. So you think beacons have shortcomings these days? You know, we actually had already put a man on the moon and stuff like that, but we still had beacons like this back in the day.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan. If anybody has any questions, please drop them in the chat or the Q&A or raise your hand. There are a variety of methods that you can use. But in the meantime, I have a question for you. Maybe I should already know this, but so I have a Mammut Varivox S beacon, and it does allow me to test my partner's beacons for drift. What is an allowable amount of drift that is still acceptable?
Oh, I don't remember the number off the top of my head. I remember it very well when I was teaching a lot of ski patrol courses, and we had like 50 of these things, and I was testing them all the time because they drifted like crazy. It's something like plus or minus 40, if I remember correctly. I'd have to look that up to know the exact number. The spec is also designed so that the acceptable plus or minus transmit range is less than the plus or minus receive range. So a beacon's supposed to be able to find another beacon that's drifted slightly more than that. However, if it's drifted a lot, the beacon's pretty much unfindable. Once I had, I tossed, we had so many of these and I was hiding beacons for the course. So I tossed like 5 of them into my pack. And then at the end of the day, I forgot that there was another one inside my pack. I turned it on in my hotel room. I tested the frequency and it was off by something like 100. I'm like, huh, this is interesting. I tried finding it and the transmit range was like 10 meters. I couldn't even find it inside the hotel room. I had it on a bed and I couldn't find it until I was like right up to the bed. And so scary stuff. Fortunately, there aren't too many of these out there, and I've never heard of other beacons having that tendency to drift. But given that these models have, like Varivox, have that feature, very valuable. One other thing I forgot to mention, since you mentioned the S, is I think this is still the only model that has the option to use lithium batteries. Now, you might wonder, how can a beacon power meter possibly know how much life is remaining in a set of lithium batteries? I should have added a slide for this, but with alkaline batteries, the power curve is pretty predictable. As it's being used, it gradually loses more and more. And so the beacon can sense, I think there's only about half of the original battery power in there. And so, this is how much longer it's going to last. With lithium batteries, it's like skiing off a cliff. It's like pretty much good as new. until it gives almost no warning, and then it suddenly dies. So when you're using lithium batteries, how can it possibly tell how much is left? The answer is you want to start off only with new lithium batteries, should you choose to use lithium batteries, and then never take those batteries out and use them in anything else. Because the way it's telling how much strength is left, how much life is left in those batteries, is just doing a calculation based on how long the beacon has been in transmit mode, how long it's been in search mode, and it's doing a calculation estimating how much longer those lithium batteries are going to be useful for.
Awesome. We have a question. What are software updates doing for modern beacons?
They've been pretty minor, but given that they're freely available or available at a very small charge, I strongly urge you to take advantage of that. Ortovox has a peer-to-peer function where one beacon can update the other, which is pretty cool. Others, either it can be done in certain shops or you have to mail it in. But not a bad idea to mail it in. Usually, I think the way it's like a small fee, like between $10 and $20. You pay the shipping on your end. They ship it back to you for free. They also do a complete check on the diagnostics. It's a good idea to do that. I mean, any electronics can go bad. I mean, suddenly my phone stopped giving me Android Auto in my car yesterday. What's going on with that? I don't know. No big deal. But if Beacon suddenly did that, yeah, it's kind of a big deal. So yeah, it's great that software updates are available. However, there are some models that don't have them, and that's hardly a deal killer either.
Yeah, I remember I shipped my, I had an old BCA tracker too that I shipped back to BCA, and they sent me a free shipping label to send it in and updated it for free. And there was no charge throughout the whole process. That's pretty neat.
Oh, and actually that reminds me, since you mentioned the tracker too, it's no coincidence, as the conspiracy theorists say, that I was showing off this old M2 a lot. I really like to use this as a target beacon because it has a very long, skinny body. And so it's very clear when I'm doing beacon testing what the orientation of that beacon is. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of Ortovox so-called smart antenna models and a lot of PEEPS models have two different transmit antennas. They're not that good, therefore, to use as targets if you're wanting to do it in a testing session to make sure exactly what the coupling of that beacon is. If you use an old BCA DTS or a tracker 2, instead of having the antenna on the long axis of the housing, the antennas are crossed, which means that if you have a beacon pointing directly at a practicing searcher, the antenna is actually pointing off to the side. Which side is which one is the transmitting antenna? If you look on the back of the housing, I was told that the antenna bump or hump that has the CE mark on it is the one that's actually transmitting. I'm not 100% sure on that though, so I have to ask BCA about it. Still totally fine to use as a target, just as long as you realize that the coupling is not necessarily pointing straight at the searcher, even if the long axis of the housing is.
Interesting. Awesome. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions come in. I really appreciate you taking the time, Jonathan. This has been super informative for me personally. So yeah, we will be making this presentation available again on the same website that I've just dropped in the chat. By next week, we'll post the recording, and I've also posted that link so that you can sign up for next week's webinar. There will be more details shared soon on that website. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and I'll drop my email in here too in case anybody ever needs anything or has any questions. Great. Well, thanks again, Jonathan. Have a wonderful night.
Well,
Bye-bye.